Brent from An Ordinary Shepherd, coming up with our next video, which is part 2 on the Third Commandment as we continue our run through the 10 Commandments. All right, so let's go back to Exodus 20, and we're back to the Third Commandment again. Chapter 20, verse 7 of Exodus, we get the Third Commandment here, depending on how you're counting again. You should not misuse the name of the ever-living your God, for the ever-living will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Okay, so last time we talked about what is the name of God, and that's why you hear me say ever-living instead of Lord whenever we run through the Old Testament. So we're going to go to the next part, which is prophets. Once you understand what the name of God is, then you can understand about prophets. So first we're going to go into what a true prophet is, and then we're going to go into a couple of different types of false prophets. Okay, so a true prophet is found in Deuteronomy 18. Okay, so turn to Deuteronomy 18, or we'll put it up on the screen for you. We'll start with chapter 15. The ever-living, your God, will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. Now this is Moses saying this. You must listen to him, for this is what you asked the ever-living your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the ever-living our God, nor see this great fire any more, or we will die. So this is when God boomed out over the mountains, and whenever they were at the base of Mount Horeb, and they all got scared and told Moses to go talk to him instead, and to come back and tell him what he said. The ever-living said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words, that the prophet speaks in my name. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the names of other gods, is to be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the ever-living? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the ever-living does not take place or come true, that is a message the ever-living has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. So do not be alarmed. Okay, so now we've got right here a true prophet. So what does a prophet do? A prophet says something on behalf of God. God has a message that he wants to give his people, and so the prophet will come, use the words God's given him to relay that message. And often, like you said, if he says something's going to happen, it's going to happen. And there's often some kind of proof that he is who he says he is. So, for instance, if he makes a prophecy, if he says something's going to happen, it's going to happen. If it doesn't happen, well, then that didn't come from God, because God would have known it was going to happen. Sometimes it's a great miracle or something like this. So, if he performs a miracle and says he's got a message from God, well, then you should listen to him, okay? All right, so that's a true prophet. A true prophet is there to tell God's people what God's will is, what he wants them to know. All right, now there's two main types of false prophets. So one we saw just right here at the end of this passage. So we're back in Deuteronomy 18, from 18 to 22, when he says he will raise up a prophet, and they say, well, how will we know? And he's like, well, if he says something is going to happen and it doesn't happen, well, then it wasn't from me. That's presumption. Then that's a false prophet. And there's a couple different examples of this in the Bible. Okay, so if you look at Jeremiah chapter 28, my my headings on my little Bible here even says the false prophet Hananiah. So basically what's happening is that Jeremiah lived in the time of the southern kingdom of Judah, and they were being attacked by Babylon, okay? And they were about to be carried off into captivity. And so Jeremiah's whole thing is trying to prepare, he's preaching to everyone, trying to prepare them for the woe that's about to come onto them. And anyway, he didn't get a lot of traction. So so here we have, going through the beginning in verse 1, we've got the introduction of the prophet Hananiah, son of Azur, who is from Gibeon. And he said to Jeremiah, in the house of the ever-living, in the presence of the priests and all the people, this is what the ever-living Almighty, the God of Israel, says. So here we've got a thing. So he's using God's name, okay? If you look at that, mine says capital L-O-R-D, which is what they say when they're trying to use the real name for God, okay? So he is using God's name. So right there, we know that he's either a prophet or a false prophet, because no one else uses God's name to make predictions and says this is what God says. I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. Within 2 years, I will bring back to this place all the articles of the ever-living's house that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, removed from here and took to Babylon. Okay, so he's made a prediction. So this is the future, okay? So he's saying within 2 years, so he set himself a time period. Within 2 years from the time he says this, what he said will happen will happen. He continues, I will also bring back to this place Jehoiakim, son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and all the other exiles from Judah who went to Babylon, declares the ever-living, for I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. Okay, so like I said, he's made a prediction here. And then we get a lot of back and forth between him and Jeremiah, because that's not what God's telling Jeremiah by any means. If you skip down to the bottom of this chapter, we have Jeremiah saying, Then the prophet Jeremiah said to Hananiah the prophet, Listen, Hananiah, the ever-living has not sent you, yet you have persuaded this nation to trust lies. Therefore, this is what the ever-living says, I am about to remove you from the face of the earth. This very year you are going to die, because you have preached rebellion against the ever-living. In the 7th month of that same year, Hananiah the prophet died. Okay, so we've got a false prophet, okay? Let's look at 1 Kings 22, okay? And this is back when there was Jehoshaphat. So this is going back a little bit before Jeremiah's time, before Hananiah's time. So here we have Jehoshaphat, who's king of Judah, and then there was Ahab, king of Israel, and they ruled at the same time, and this is where they had the two kingdoms, and they were related, but they weren't the same kingdom anymore. Jehoshaphat went to see the king of Israel, and the king of Israel said to him, Don't you know that Ramoth-Gilead, which is one of the cities, belongs to us, and yet we are doing nothing to retake it from the king of Aram? So he asked Jehoshaphat, Will you go with me to fight against Ramoth-Gilead? And Jehoshaphat replied to the king of Israel, I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. But Jehoshaphat also said to the king of Israel, First, seek the counsel of the ever-living. So the king of Israel brought together the prophets, about 400 men, and asked them, Shall I go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall I refrain? Go, they answered, for the Lord will give it into the king's hand. But Jehoshaphat asked, Is there no longer a prophet of the ever-living here whom we can inquire of? I like the beginning of this just because of the lesson we had last week. So if you're reading this if you're reading this in a standard way, it doesn't make any sense, because Jehoshaphat says, okay, well, let's first seek the counsel of the Lord. And then so the king of Israel brings together these prophets, and they say the Lord will give it in the king's hand. And then Jehoshaphat asks, but is there no longer a prophet of the Lord here that we can inquire of? It just doesn't make any sense when you read it like this, because it's like, okay, well, didn't they just ask a bunch of prophets of the Lord? But when you read it, like I said, when you actually use God's name and put it where it's supposed to be, and you don't substitute it for a word that means something entirely differently, this passage makes sense. He asked for the advice of the ever-living, okay? The king of Israel went to the prophets of the Lord, okay, like we talked about. That's a perfectly good translation for the word Baal. So they went to the 400 prophets of Baal, who's clearly not God, and asked them what they thought. And so Jehoshaphat comes back and is like, okay, that's great, I don't care about them. Is there a prophet of the ever-living that we can inquire of? And so, like I said, it just kind of teases out that issue a little bit better from what we talked about last time. All right, so going to the bottom here. So he said, yes, but he never prophesies anything good. And his name is Micaiah. Okay, so Micaiah, son of Imlah, was brought in, and they asked him what he would say. So look at verse 23. So the ever-living has put a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all these prophets of yours. The ever-living has decreed disaster for you. Then Zedekiah, the son of Kena'anah, went up and slapped Micaiah in the face. Which way did the spirit from the ever-living go when he went from me to speak to you? So basically, Zedekiah, this other prophet, Zedekiah, basically is saying, listen, all the spirits from God come through me, and the spirit of the ever-living God came to me and told me this. And so when you say something different, I'm going to slap you and then ask where the spirit went between you and me to get this different message. So he's, again, Zedekiah is invoking the word of God. And then Micaiah replied, you will find out on the day you go to hide in the inner room. And so basically, if you read through the rest of this passage, you'll find out that, yes, Micaiah is the one that actually had the word of the ever-living God in his soul and was able to transmit that as a prophet. And all these other, Zedekiah was faking, and he ended up dying later on. Spoilers. And in addition to Ahab and the rest of them. Okay, so that's one kind of false prophet, and this falls strictly under this third commandment. You will not take my name in vain. You will not, that's the classic reading of that third commandment. So these prophets are people who invoke the name of God, okay? Invoke the name of the ever-living God, and then they say things that clearly aren't true, and they say messages that God didn't tell them to say. So that's the oldest version of a false prophet, or at least one of the oldest. So, I mean, you can think about this. This is not something that's new. It's not something that has gone away either. I can give you 100 examples of people who predict end times, like, the earth, God told me that the world was going to end on June 21st of 2012. Well, that's fantastic. Guess what? It didn't happen, so you're a false prophet. Sorry, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you said God told you to say something, and what you say doesn't come true, then you spoke presumptuously, and you're a false prophet. There's no other ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's right there in the Bible. You can't get away from it, okay? It's right there in Deuteronomy 18 to 22, okay? It's right there. There's no getting around it. If somebody predicts something and it doesn't happen, then, I'm sorry, you're a false prophet. There's a lot of other people who use God's name to do other things, like God said to send me $5. God said that you need to come here and donate your life savings. God needs you to give me your car. God told me to tell you this. God told me to tell you that. And these people come with no power. They come with no prediction, okay? And whereas in the Old Testament, and whenever a prophet came, they always had some kind of veracity. They always gave a prophecy. They always performed miracles. They always had something to back up, something supernatural to back up the fact that they were from God. There was never just a guy just turning around saying, look at me, look what I said, I'm awesome, God told you to do this, okay? So, like I said, this is one kind of false prophet, someone who says that God told him to tell you something, and he didn't. Okay, but let's not get too hopped up on this supernatural stuff that we were talking about a minute ago. Yes, the prophets that were sent by God did have supernatural abilities to prove that they were coming from God. But that's not there's another kind of false prophet that plays into that a little bit. So let's go back to Deuteronomy 13, verse 1. If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder, and if that sign or wonder spoken of takes place, and the prophet says, let us follow other gods you have not known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The ever-living your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart and with all your soul. It is the ever-living your God you must follow, and him you must revere. Keep his commands and obey him, serve him, and hold fast to him. Okay, so now we have here a second type of false prophet, and that's people who can foretell, people that can perform signs and wonders, okay, or people that can at least say that the signs or wonders are coming and let you know. So there's people clearly have supernatural power, but what's the difference with these people? Well, they lead away to other gods, okay, so they will sometimes just straight up invoke the name of other gods, like when they had the priests of Baal, okay, sometimes they'll just completely go off the reservation and talk about other gods, but there's also an exhortation in there to follow God's commandments and stand fast to God. Okay, so to the ever-living God. So this is the other kind. So these are people that preach against what God has said before. God doesn't change. God is the same always. God doesn't contradict himself. God doesn't act against himself. Okay, so if God has established something, he's not going to come back and contradict himself on that. So it was very easy for some of these Old Testament people, whenever they saw someone supernatural, to say, for instance, God has told me to come and that you don't have to, let's say, God has sent me to ancient Israel at the time of King David to tell all of you that he's done with the Sabbath and it's over. Okay, and here, look, there's a pillar of fire from the sky. This is to prove that I'm from God. Well, they'd say, okay, well, you use the name of God, and you have supernatural power, but you clearly taught something which is contrary to the prior teachings of God. And so we know in that case that you're not from God because God cannot teach against himself. So you've contradicted God's written law, and so we know that you're a false prophet. Okay, so you can see this, just back here in 1 Kings 22 when we were talking about it, okay? So when we're talking about these other prophets of Baal who were trying to say that the king of Israel was going to be successful in his tirade against Ramoth Gilead, if you look at verse 14 of 1 Kings 22, but Micaiah said, "As surely as the ever-living lives, I can only tell what the ever-living tells me." When he arrived, the king asked him, "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth Gilead or not?" "Attack and be victorious," he answered, "for the ever-living will give it into the king's hand." The king said to him, "How many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth and the name of the ever-living?" So he must have said this kind of snarky or sarcastically, because the king could obviously tell that he wasn't being honest. Then Micaiah answered, "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd." And the ever-living said, "These people have no master. Let each one go home in peace." The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "Didn't I tell you he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad?" Micaiah continued, "Therefore, hear the word of the ever-living. I saw the ever-living sitting on his throne, with all the multitudes of heaven sitting around him on his right and on his left." And the ever-living said, "Who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth Gilead and going to his death there?" One suggested this, another that. Finally, a spirit came forward, stood before the ever-living, and said to him, "I will entice him." Guess which spirit that was. "By what means?" the ever-living asked. "I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all of his prophets," he said. "You will succeed in enticing him," said the ever-living. "Go and do it." So now the ever-living has put a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all these prophets of yours. The ever-living has decreed disaster for you. And that's when he got slapped in the face. Okay, so here we see that these people are making predictions, but there are spirits that have supernatural power. This was a deceiving spirit, who are sent by God himself to test. And this one was specifically sent to test the king of Israel and to have him go to his death because he was sinning against God so greatly that this was God's judgment against him. But even so, he gave him a true prophet. Micaiah was there the whole time. So God had a true prophet there telling this king what was going on. And so he was able to make that choice between the true prophet and the false prophets. And he even knew the whole backstory. And so it's not like God had any fault in this. God gave him every out and every opportunity to follow him. And this man just chose absolutely wrongly. Okay, so and there's other examples of this. So you look at Exodus in chapter 7, verse 9. When Pharaoh says to you, "Perform a miracle," then say to Aaron, "Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it'll become a snake." So this is way back with Moses and the Pharaoh. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the ever-living commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of the Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same things by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Okay, so here we see these wise men, these magic men in the ancient Egypt were able to perform miracles. Well, where did this miracle power come from? There's only one person who can grant the power for miracles, and that's the ever-living God. And so he must have given them that power. It's basically, like he said before, "I will give you a dreamer of dreams or a worker of wonders to test you." So this is the second kind of false prophet, and that's the false prophet who has some kind of supernatural agency. He has supernatural ability. Did you ever wonder why Jesus was walking around in the Holy Land and all the Jewish people came up to him and say, "Okay, that's great. You healed someone. All right, that's great. You raised somebody from the dead. All right, that's great. You turned water into wine. But who sent you? And who are you? And by whose authority do you teach?" Because they knew that, okay, supernatural by itself was great, but it had to be in the teaching of the true ever-living God. And so they were asking him, and he would always reply coyly, because we talked about before, saying the name of God, was tantamount to a huge sin that would get him in a lot of trouble and in his ministry before his time. So he would answer them, well, I come in the name of my Father. And like, well, who's your father? Well, if you knew my Father, then you would know me. And so he spoke in riddles about this whenever they would ask him, well, who sent you? Because, again, you could show up in Israel today and start performing miracles. You could, bring fire from the sky and part the waters and everything else, and you're not going to get a bunch of Jewish people to convert to whatever religion you're claiming just because of the miracles. Because they know better. They know that God sends people to test them, even people that have supernatural powers, to see how strong their faith really is. Do they love God? Do they love goodness? Do they love righteousness? Do they love love itself? Or are they impressed by a show of power? And so this is the second kind, the kind that lead people away from God, either frankly to other gods, or people that come in the name of God, have supernatural powers, but lead them away from what's been taught before. And so then we come to the New Testament here in 1 John chapter 4. And this is where it comes kind of full circle for believers here. And this is 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, but every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, whom you've heard is coming and is even already in the world. So, even here we have a test. This is not a new form of test. This is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. Just because you have a supernatural spirit does not necessarily mean that it came from the ever-living God. And what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to test these spirits. We can test them by the Old Testament, knowing what God taught then. We can test them by the New Testament to see if they acknowledge that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and our Savior. And so, despite the fact that something supernatural may happen, doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming from God and that God wants us to follow that person. And there's any number of religions that have been started under supernatural means since the time of Christ and even before that clearly taught either against the old teachings of the Old Testament or clearly contradicted the teachings of the New Testament. And it's really easy to see. If you have a firm foundation, you're not going to be led astray by these sorts of things. And so, like I said, just because something is supernatural is no assurance that it's coming from God, and you shouldn't be easily impressed by that. You should test the spirits. And so, like I said, true prophets come from God, speak what God wants them to speak, and has some supernatural evidence of that authority. Okay, God doesn't make you wonder if this person he sent is from him. Okay, so what are two different types of false prophets? The ones who come in God's name, but they don't really have a message from him, okay? And the other kind of false prophets are the people that come with real supernatural authority, but they lead people away from the true God or the true Christ. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned a little bit. And like I said, that finishes up the two-part lesson here on the name of God. The next lesson we're going to do next time is on the Sabbath, and it ought to be a little bit shorter than these two. So anyway, thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and y'all have a blessed night. We've got a Twitter link below, I think, and usually a Facebook link if y'all want to come follow us so you can keep apprised of when the next message is coming out. Thanks a lot, and be blessed.